So let's jump right into a really fascinating and honestly kind of counterintuitive idea. What if the very policies that were designed to slow a country down actually ended up hitting the accelerator? We're going to look at how US tech restrictions may have accidentally fueled China's incredible rise. And that brings us to the big question for this entire explainer. Did these containment policies actually backfire? I mean, did trying to limit China's access to key American technologies end up creating the very competitor everyone was trying to prevent? We're going to dig into the evidence, case by case.
All right, to get our heads around this, we first need to understand something the source material calls the Containment Paradox. It's this fundamental mismatch between what a policy is supposed to do and what it actually does. The paradox is pretty simple, but it has some really profound consequences. On one hand, you have the goal of these restrictions, which was totally straightforward: slow down China's tech development and keep America in the lead. But the reality? Well, it often turned out to be the exact opposite. These restrictions basically lit a fire under China to innovate on its own, pushing them towards self-reliance and, you guessed it, creating brand new global competitors in the process.
And look, this paradox isn't just some abstract theory. It's a pattern, a playbook that has repeated itself across some major, high-stakes technology sectors. Let's dive into the first case study.
First up, navigation. For decades, the entire world, more or less, ran on America's global positioning system, GPS. Now, if you're China, relying on a system that's controlled by the US military, well, that looks like a huge national security risk. What happens if one day someone just flips a switch and cuts off your access?
So their response was to build their own system from scratch, the BeiDou satellite network. The immediate result? Complete navigation autonomy. That vulnerability? Gone. But they didn't just stop there. China then started offering BeiDou to its partners, especially countries involved in its Belt and Road Initiative. And now, for the first time ever, GPS has a direct global competitor. Okay, next, let's look up to the stars. Back in 2011, a US law, the Wolf Amendment, effectively banned NASA from working with China. This meant they were completely locked out of the International Space Station, the ISS. A pretty clear message of exclusion.
So what happened? You guessed it, China went and built its own, the Tiangong space station. Now here's where it gets really interesting. The ISS is set to be retired around 2030. That means China could soon be operating the only crewed space station in orbit. Think about that. They went from being the excluded party to potentially being the go-to orbital hub for much of the world.
Let's come back down to Earth and talk aviation. For as long as most of us can remember, the commercial airline market has been completely dominated by two players, Boeing and Airbus. That duopoly, plus tight restrictions on aerospace tech, created this massive wall that was almost impossible for any new competitor to climb over.
China's response? They decided to play the long game with the COMAC C-19 project. And the goal here wasn't just to build a single airplane. The real prize was to build an entire domestic supply chain from the ground up. The outlook for the future is pretty clear, even if it's a long road. First, they capture their own huge domestic market. Then they expand regionally, and every jet they sell is a little bit less leverage for that Western duopoly. So while all these trends were building for years, one specific event really acted as a massive catalyst. It was like throwing gasoline on the fire, accelerating this push for self-reliance across the entire board. And that event was the US campaign against the tech giant Huawei. The story of what Huawei did next is pretty remarkable. In 2019, those heavy US sanctions hit, cutting them off from critical American chips and Google's Android services. It was an existential threat. So they were forced to pivot, fast. They developed their own operating system, Harmony OS, and went all in on cloud services. And then, in 2023, came the big shock, the launch of the Mate 60 Pro smartphone, running on an advanced 7nm chip made right there in China, something many experts thought was totally impossible under the sanctions.
And this gets to a really key point. Huawei's fight for survival became a national rallying cry. The sanctions didn't just hit one company. They sent a clear signal to every tech company in China that self-sufficiency wasn't just a nice goal to have, it was a matter of survival. Huawei basically wrote the playbook for everyone else.
So, you take this repeating pattern, from GPS to space stations to Huawei, And the result is this massive shift in the global landscape. We are now seeing the real-time emergence of what people are starting to call the Great Tech Divide.
And nowhere is this divide clearer than in the fight over semiconductors, the tiny brains that run everything. To counter the restrictions, China has just unleashed enormous resources. That number you see on the screen, over $143 billion. That's the scale of government funding being poured into building a self-reliant chip industry from the ground up.
And all that money is driving some incredibly fast progress. We're talking about huge advances in domestic chip-making tech, that surprise 7-nanometer chip we just talked about, and also a really smart strategic pivot to something called RISC-V. Now, all you need to know about RISC-V is that it's an open-source chip architecture. That means it isn't controlled by any single Western company, which makes it a powerful way to design chips outside of the existing restrictions. They've basically compressed decades of development into just a few frantic years.
Which brings us to where we are now, the formation of two parallel tech ecosystems. On one side, you have the Western sphere, built on standards we all know, like GPS and the SWIFT payment system. But now you have a growing Chinese sphere with its own alternatives, like BeiDou for navigation and CIPS for payments. And right in the middle, you have this contested zone where nations around the world suddenly have more choices than ever before.
So what does this all mean? Where do we go from here? Well, this new reality forces us to completely rethink our tech strategy and the whole idea of what containment even is in the 21st century.
Because this is the cycle we've seen play out over and over again. It's like a domino effect. Step 1, a U.S. restriction is put in place. Step 2, this creates an urgent need to innovate inside China, often with massive government backing. Step 3, that innovation leads to a new domestic alternative. Step 4, that alternative gets exported and creates new global competition. And the final step, the original leverage the U.S. had is now significantly reduced.
So to wrap this all up, the source material really leaves us with 4 big takeaways. First, and most obviously, containment policies can and often do backfire. Second, these parallel tech ecosystems, they're not a prediction anymore, they are an emerging reality. Third, this new world demands a complete strategic rethink. And fourth, the ability to use technology as a primary tool of geopolitical power might be diminishing.
And that leaves us with one final critical question for the future. What's next? Are we heading for a complete split of the tech world? A messy, selective integration where we pick and choose, or a totally new era of competitive coexistence? The path forward isn't set, and the choices made in the next few years will define everything. Thanks for joining The Explainer.